Hey everyone, before we get into this episode of The Overlook, I want to tell you about a brand new podcast that's all about Asheville, only each episode is under 5 minutes long. It's a daily radio-styled newscast called Wake Up Asheville. It's a morning podcast updating you on all the important local headlines. We check in with every credible local news source, then boil it all down to what you need to know in under 5 minutes. It's designed to tell you what you need to know and let you get on with your day. There's even a Spanish language version called Despierta Asheville. Wake Up Asheville and Despierta Asheville are both free and available every weekday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
I am a maker, a builder, a baker, although sometimes my messes are all that you'll find. I'll tell a story, both true and allegory. Oh, the process is precious, so it takes up all my time.
Esther Manheimer is serving her third term as Asheville's mayor, and the challenges this city faces today and the strategies deployed to tackle them have evolved a lot during her time in office.
Being on the council of any city, especially a progressive city that's got a lot going on, and it can be loud and it can sometimes be hard to think clearly, get your way through each issue and feel like you're making your best informed decision. That's just a constant challenge.
This is The Overlook with Matt Peiken, a podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. Today, we check in with Mayor Manheimer around a variety of issues: homelessness, affordable housing, enforcing the city's policy on short-term rentals, and property tax increases, along with boosting the salaries for police officers and firefighters. We also get her assessment of how this council has performed its duties, her thoughts on President Biden passing the baton to Kamala Harris, and what she sees for her own political future. We recorded this conversation July 23rd, just hours before a regularly scheduled city council meeting. Mayor Manheimer told me she expected quite a turnout to voice opinions about a planned development in Haw Creek, and that led me to asking whether Asheville has an issue with NIMBYism.
You know what's funny? I would say we've moved past NIMBY because people will come and say, I am not a NIMBY, but, and then they will tell you why they oppose the project. So it's like they're aware of the issue around the need for housing and that NIMBY might be a negative term. But obviously, sometimes in the opposition of a project, it sounds a lot like NIMBY.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to broach with you is about how the city policies are around affordable housing and initiatives that have happened in your time on city council. And how do you feel the city is keeping up or doing when it comes to opening up channels for more affordable housing and working with developers to create more opportunities there?
The city's developed quite a toolbox around affordable housing, so much so that we're actually an example to a lot of other cities that they want to copy some of our programs and policies around affordable housing. And we have also implemented some of the changes that a lot of progressive cities are trying to put in place around affordable housing. We have not, though, done some of the more extreme changes that you might see in some places, like eliminate altogether single-family housing zoning. So we haven't gone that far. But we have tried to either create opportunities for developers to include affordable housing in their projects and have some sort of reward system for that. That's because the state of North Carolina doesn't let cities require it, but we can incentivize it.
Yeah, from your vantage point, how successful have those incentives been? Because we only have so much power here in the city and the county to do things. What are some of the newer things in our toolbox that you think are making a difference that other cities are emulating?
So it ranges. So some things might be a density bonus. You can do more density in your project without having to come to council for approval if you're in an urban corridor or within a certain distance of an urban corridor. That's a basic example of something. We also have something called the Land Use Incentive Grant, which is technically on hold right now while we revamp it yet again, which provides basically a tax rebate to developers that will include affordable housing in their development. And there's a lot of debate there around tax policy, and I think is very fascinating to look at what is the cost of a program like that to a city, because you have a developer that's going to take a piece of land, that might have only paid $2,000 in taxes a year, and now all of a sudden it's going to pay, I don't know, $40,000 in taxes a year, but they're going to get a large portion of that rebated back to them because they're providing affordable housing. And if you look at that on a per unit subsidy, what is the cost of that to a city? Could we have taken that money and done something else with it that would have gotten us farther in this affordable housing crisis, or serve the community better in a different way, maybe not even through housing? So that's a debate that you're going to have around these incentive programs, whether or not the cost is too great versus what you get from it.
Yeah, where do you sit on that in terms of that debate?
I have, over the years, become somewhat more skeptical of those programs. I'm very resentful of the federal government not stepping up and providing more housing for people because they can do so much more. They already have a HUD voucher system in place. We estimate, I think we have about 5,000 residents in Asheville that are living on federal housing vouchers, whether they're in public housing or in a privately owned multifamily housing apartment complex or whatever that takes federal vouchers. The federal government just has the ability with the push of a button to go so much farther than a city like ours struggling with a budget the size of ours, $250,000 a year. And you look at the cost to us, to the taxpayers on a per unit basis, you do have to ask yourself, does this make the most sense for a city, for a county to facilitate this housing? Or does it make more sense to go lobby the federal government, which I've done personally just in the last few weeks, to try to increase that voucher program and provide more benefit?
You just got to a question I was going to ask you. You have lobbied the federal government. Obviously, I would imagine the Biden administration is at least to some degree sympathetic. You might have some kind of entree there. Tell me about what you're hearing when you talk about this in your lobbying efforts. What do you hear back?
So I would say I hear three things. One, yes, the Biden administration is very supportive and has asked for an increase in the voucher program through the president's budget ask, of course, which is subject to Congress's approval. What I hear from the Republican-controlled Congress is we can't just give people things. We need to just create programs that provide for tax credit lending, which these are also valid other ways that affordable housing is leveraged, but it's a philosophical policy difference around taxes and subsidies. But the other thing, and the most concerning thing that I hear on this recent trip I went with the U.S. Conference of Mayors with a small cohort of mayors from around the country, is kind of the bureaucracy challenges, just trying to loosen up some of these programs to make them more available to communities and to individuals. It gets bogged down in things like, how does the Treasury Department define this word? Or how does... It's things like that you think, oh, Lord, is this ever really going to become something that's more viable, or will it just get bogged down? Some of the challenges, for example, when I was on this most recent trip, I think everyone would agree that mental health has become a bigger issue than it has historically for cities all over the country. But yet the Secretary of Health and Human Services reported to us that his department experienced the deepest cuts of any department federally. And so how is this possible that we're in agreement that mental health is a crisis in our cities, in our states, in our country, but yet we're not funding a department that could help with this? And I assume it's because of this difference of opinion that the Republican-controlled Congress feels like this issue should be handled locally, should be funded locally, maybe on a state level, city, county, what have you, and they're not willing to step up even though they have the biggest pocketbook.
Let me ask you, speaking of, you're saying Congress is in a position to maybe help and they're not. I know you have at least met a little bit with Chuck Edwards. You were on that crime summit that he threw, and I was there. I recorded it. I was wondering if you've had any conversations with Congressman Edwards around this or any other issues to try to get some movement, or when you talk about these policy debates, are you just at a stalemate in terms of just how you come to these issues? It's just a completely fundamentally different vantage point on looking at these.
I unfortunately think that these issues have become so partisan and just transcends even me and Chuck having a conversation about it. But I think the way it's been framed from the right is this is just a matter of more policing and tougher DAs. That's obviously what the problem is, and we just need to arrest more people. But I think what Chuck Edwards heard at that crime summit that he hosted from across the board, even from these leaders in other counties and red counties, folks that are in law enforcement, is no, really, we need help with mental health services, with drug addiction services. We need to help these individuals so that they don't end up in a situation where they do need to be arrested. And that we can't arrest our way out of this crisis. But that doesn't feed the national narrative. That's not going to go on Fox News or NPR. And the fact that it's more complicated doesn't sell. So how do you give your little one-liner and your zinger and get reelected? I guess that's how.
You're touching on something that I also want to talk about, the Business Improvement District, that the new ambassador program that is part of this. And I know approaching street crime, drug use is a mandate of this bid. Before we get to the effectiveness of it so far, and from what you're able to see, it's still so early on, but it seemed like it passed city council very easily, despite, from what I could hear, there was quite a bit of opposition to it, or at least concern about it. I had a couple episodes of my show about that, and I was just curious where you came to on this. I know you were among the supporters. Talk about your support for this. What was it about the criticisms that either didn't ring true or just were maybe elevated, exaggerated, that propelled you to vote for this?
Let me first say, personally, I have been on a journey this last several years to learn everything and anything I can about homelessness and all the issues related to it and what are the most effective ways to tackle this crisis. So I've personally been serving in various roles, interviewing folks all across the nation about how they're addressing homelessness in their community. And I'm now serving on the Continuum of Care, our newly formed Continuum of Care here in Asheville-Buncombe County, which is a direct result of the recommendations of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And I'm committed to implementing all of their recommendations and carrying that out to a T. I was just meeting today with some folks that are interested in rebooting the Ramada as permanent supportive housing. I was meeting with Homeward Bound today. The county has just issued an RFP to look at opening a new low barrier shelter. These are all efforts I'm behind, and I do not want to do one thing to undermine that work and to support those who are experiencing homelessness and the people who are serving them so that we can reduce that crisis in our community and better address it. So let me just say that first. And if I thought for 1 second that a bid or an ambassador program would disrupt that work, I wouldn't have supported it. I love to go to other cities and look and see how they're doing things and learn from them. I was just most recently in Burlington, Vermont.
Isn't that the Asheville of the North, sort of?
Sort of is.
Yeah.
They do have the challenge of being a college town. College towns have their own serious challenges because, unfortunately, very large colleges and their student populations can depreciate a city, if you will. But in Burlington, they had what appeared to be an ambassador program downtown, but they ran it through their Parks and Rec department.
That's an interesting approach.
Yeah, no, and I think it's another way to do it. I then was in Boston, and they have an ambassador program that looks a lot more like volunteers who are sort of helping guide tourists and provide information. Both of these cities are experiencing incredible homelessness crises. That is very apparent. I think it's going to be important for us to make sure our ambassadors receive enough training to be able to help direct services to those who are experiencing homelessness, whether they're doing it themselves or they're understanding who to contact, whether our community paramedics, our firefighter paramedics who are serving as well in that capacity, to be able to help bring resources to folks and help address crises as they develop. They're, of course, not armed. They're not going to be themselves folks that are going to be expected to resolve these issues, but more be in
eyes and ears.
Eyes and ears and be able to connect people to services. I think there is some discussion about whether or not you would have some trained outreach, like social worker types of folks who might also be included in a program like that. And I'll be interested to see what the community provides as feedback. Right now, we're developing the RFP to bid this out for the bid. And so we'll see what we get there. But I think it will be a smooth transition, and I think people will appreciate the end result.
I think one of the criticisms, which I can understand, is there's a vague language around the subjectivity of ambassadors deciding what behavior is unacceptable. I can't remember the exact wording in the bid, but it was like if an ambassador finds a certain behavior unacceptable or disturbing of downtown, then they would call police or whoever they would bring in. And it seemed to bestow quite a bit of power in that person, even though they don't have...
They won't have any
right.
power in that regard. Again, I hear the concern around this. I think it can be addressed through the RFP process and aligning up our partner who's going to carry out this work. That's just not the observations I've seen of how bids work in other cities. It's much more benign than that. It's more of folks that are eyes and ears and able to call for help if help is needed. And we have an opportunity to reevaluate. The city has quite a lot of leverage in this because we're awarding the contract. The council's awarding the contract. The public can come and review it and make comments about it and let us know how they feel about it or how it should be implemented. So
I suppose you'll have to have a long lease on Harris Cherokee Center for the crowds that would come out for these.
Possibly. It's funny how things ebb and flow. You get a big turnout for an issue, but then it dies down and another issue will become the issue of the day and a lot of people come out. So I will be interested to see how that develops, but I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with the end result and they don't think that we're changing the nature of our city, our funkiness, our uniqueness. That is not the goal at all.
I want to tie back to something we talked about just a little bit ago around affordable housing and the short-term rental policies of the city and enforcement of the city. It seems like that's become more and more with 17 Market Street, and there's some other developments that people are saying, hey, these are illegal STRs. Where is the city at in its both setting policy around this? Has it changed, evolved, and more important, enforcement of this?
So the city hasn't changed its policy. What has changed is that the North Carolina Court of Appeals weighed in on this. There was a case that made its way through the system that came out of Wilmington. And the end result of that case is that cities can no longer require an annual permit. So we can't require folks to come and re-up their annual permit so we can track who's operating a legal STR. So there were a bunch that were grandfathered in the downtown and a bunch in the River Arts District. And then we also allow homestays in neighborhoods. So before you had to come and get your permit, we could keep track of who was doing this. And then the court said you can't require a permit, but you can regulate the short-term rentals through zoning. That just means that we can create zoning, which we have in place, that says in this zoning classification, say a residential, short-term rentals are not allowed. It's not an allowed use. That's the same as an asphalt plant is not allowed or a dental office is not allowed. You can't require that person to come in every year and say, I'd like to report that I'm in compliance with your zoning ordinance. It's up to us to try to figure out who is violating the zoning ordinance and enforce against them. That depends heavily on people reporting folks. And you can do that through the Asheville app so that we can then investigate any alleged violation. That's really frustrating. One other component to add, not only can we no longer require an annual permit, but none of the platforms will share their data with us. So Airbnb won't give us a list of all their properties in Asheville. They won't do that.
You can't subpoena it.
We cannot. No.
Is that because it's a North Carolina law that we can't do that? Or is that just nationally? No municipality has the ability to do that.
So my understanding is there are a couple locations, a couple places like in California or maybe New Orleans, where either a law has been passed that requires these platforms to provide that data, and that's how they're able to get it. But as far as I understand, there's not a law in North Carolina that allows us to require that data to be provided. Now, it is in the aggregate because the TDA collects a room tax on short-term rentals. And so they have a lump sum number. We can see, okay, there's this many, and this is how much money you're collecting through short-term rentals. But we cannot require Airbnb to give us a list of all their addresses. We know, I believe this last year, that the Tourism Development Authority reported that countywide, something like 37% of their overall revenues came from short-term rentals.
37% of county revenues?
It's 37% of the room tax.
Oh, room tax.
Collected. Just to put that in perspective, I think when I first was in office, I think I recall the Tourism Development Authority might have collected $6 million plus annually across the entire county in room tax. And that would be...
God, that's a long time ago.
That would be a long time ago. That would be like hotels or bed and breakfast. And with the rise of short-term rentals, that's been added and revenues have grown and grown. And it was around $40 million collected last year. And 37% of that was short-term rentals. So it's interesting, the conversation we have in our community around tourism and a lot of focus on hotels. But as you can see, certainly a lot of the activity is actually coming from short-term rental.
Now, because you can't get lists from Airbnb or VRBO or any other platform, you're entirely dependent on people reporting this. What happens when people report this? Does the city have a dedicated staff for this? And if so, is it just like one person or two people? What happens?
So it's generally handled through zoning enforcement. So it'd be the same person who gets reports about zoning violations generally. And I can't tell you exactly how many staff are dedicated to working on zoning enforcement, but there are folks that do it. I remember years ago when this started, San Francisco said they were hiring a department of 20 people to work on their short-term rental enforcement and regulation. We don't have anything like that, but we reportedly do have one of the highest per capita short-term rental activity in the nation. It would be incredibly helpful if we were able to leverage some of the room tax or some other revenues from this activity to be able to work on enforcement, but that's not how it works. We're not allowed to charge a permitting fee, which is how we were funding. We were paying for enforcement, and we're not allowed to leverage any of the room tax that's derived from it. So you have an unfunded enforcement system.
Because that's different than, let's say, parking tickets. You can have people enforce your parking tickets. That revenue does come back to the city.
That's right.
So what is the penalty? Let's say somebody is found to be operating a short-term rental not according to the proper zoning. Do they pay a fee? And if so, where does that go? Or what is the penalty? How challenging is it to enforce any penalty?
It's very challenging. And I'm not the best person to ask about the details on zoning enforcement, but there is a procedure that you've got to go through to do zoning enforcement. We're trying, and obviously it's meeting resistance and is very difficult to do. Early on, when we had the permitting process, we did take a few people to court, and we were able to implement a fine of, I think we had to make it $500 a day, because otherwise people would just say, I don't care if it's $100 a day, I'll just wrap that into I'll make it up in my rental fee.
Exactly.
So we had to make it high enough that people would pay attention to it. But we're no longer allowed to use that system.
Is that because of the North Carolina Court of Appeals?
Yes.
What was that rationale? Can you even say what was their rationale for not allowing this?
I'm probably not doing it justice, but the opinion basically hangs its hat on a statute that talks about cities' inability to regulate rentals. And that statute, I will say, was drafted a long time ago before short-term rentals were ever envisioned, and it was more of a landlord rights type of statute that the legislature put in place, which again is the way North Carolina has balanced landlord versus tenant rights, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are not surprised to hear. And so my understanding is they took that statute and said, we're going to take this to mean that it includes also short-term rental regulations, and so you can't require any kind of permitting.
More after this. Hey everyone, Matt Peiken here from The Overlook, and I'll get back to my conversation in just a moment. But I'm asking you, the listener, yes, you listening this very moment, is The Overlook making a difference in your connection to Asheville? Do you know more about what makes this city tick and where we're struggling? If you had to give up 1 cup of coffee every month to do your part to keep this show going, would you step up? If you answered yes to any of that, and I really hope you did, please join dozens of other listeners by supporting The Overlook with Matt Peiken through my Patreon campaign by giving just $5 a month. Give it higher levels and you'll earn free tickets to my live podcasting events. Your support means the world to me and helps keep this show free for anyone to hear. Go to patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. Touching on the subject of how cities can bring in money, you don't have money that you can bring in from enforcement of this. I want to talk about property tax increases, and we are seeing property tax increases. Talk about how fraught that is here and the discussions that you had internally with your council peers and colleagues about how to go about framing property tax increases that are happening.
So you've hit on one of my favorite topics, which is tax policy. And I'm not kidding.
That's one of your favorite
That's one
topics?
of my favorite topics.
It has to be somebody's favorite topic.
Well, and I bring it up as much as I possibly can, including to the Speaker of the North Carolina House, because I think it's such a big issue for cities. Cities in North Carolina have such limited resources. We can only depend on property taxes. We get some sales tax revenue, very small slice of sales tax revenue. Most of that goes to the state to balance the state budget. We get fees, but our fees cannot exceed the cost to provide the service. So, for example, if you're applying to build a home, there's a fee for your application, but it can only cover the cost of the administration to review the application and basically enforce regulations around construction. It can't be a cash cow. You can't.
And that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Perfectly
Right.
rational.
Right. And you can't use, for example, your water funds to subsidize your general fund. So there's all kinds of limitations. Some of them are very sound, such as not using utility funds to subsidize your general fund. But we can't make a decision unilaterally, for example, to impose a new tax like a food and beverage tax or an additional sales tax. If you look at home rule states like Boulder, Colorado, they can leverage marijuana sales tax. Absolutely not. We don't have anything like that in North Carolina for cities. And the way our state is growing and the way cities are developing, there's basically one well to go back to, and that is property taxes. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. If you talk to other cities and other states and you look at the revenue mix of their fund balance or whatever they're using to fund their cities, it's much more diverse. They have the opportunity to leverage so many different resources. Another example, in North Carolina, they got rid of what's basically a big box retail tax that brought in a couple $1 million a year for the city and the big box stores. So yes, we're left arguing with ourselves about where to get more resources and how to do that. And the one lever that we can control is property taxes. We can raise fees for garbage and water and things like that. But again, that's very limited, and you don't want to overburden folks with those kinds of fees because that really raises the cost of running a household.
Are we long overdue for a property tax increase? Has it been a while since we've had it, or are we barely keeping up with this property tax increase with our ability to cover city services and raise the pay of police officers and fire department workers? Where this property tax increase, are we going to have to come back for another one in 2 years? How much is this covering?
So the property tax increase that the city landed on this year was very small. We ended up with, I believe, 0.63 pennies. So not even a penny. The county did more. I think they landed around 2 cents or 2.5 cents, something like that. So I think where people are going to feel more of an effect than the actual property tax rate increase is their property value increase. So, right, we're in a revaluation year. That'll go into effect for next year. So the county, of course, conducts all the appraisals and notifies everyone of their new value. And I'm expecting, given the increased cost of housing for the entire United States, not just Asheville, North Carolina, but for everywhere, including our state and our city, I'm anticipating that people are going to see a much larger number. So on the one hand, they're owning a piece of property that's more valuable. Great. That's great. Probably eventually. But for now, what that means is the property taxes will be increasing. So that's another reason why we've implemented a program with the county to help offset that for people who are income qualified to be able to try to get some relief on their property taxes. And the county has put that information out there so folks can take advantage of it. And there's also, the state has the homestead exemption, but that's for seniors who are income qualified, like my mom, who qualify for a reduction in their property taxes.
I've heard conflicting information that there are some cities in this state that are treated differently than other cities when it comes to tax policy, that being able to get creative around taxing. Like I said, I've heard that Raleigh can do certain things or Charlotte can do certain things that we can't do. Is that not true?
So there's local legislation that affects different municipalities and counties differently. So an example, in Charlotte, they get revenue from rental cars, I believe it is. I don't know how they did that. That's some kind of local legislation they got, and we don't have access to that. So there are some examples like that. There are some places that have a food and beverage tax. When I'm talking about these one-offs, these were all enabled legislatively. These cannot be done solely on the part of the local government. The legislature allowed for these opportunities to happen. So there are some places that have a food and beverage tax, and we don't.
So this legislature, at least in some of these instances, has played favorites in a sense, or singled out, oh, you can do this, but in Wake County, for instance, you can do this, but in Buncombe County, you can't do this.
That's right. Or another example would be in Wake County, Orange County, Durham County, they have held a vote on a quarter-cent sales tax for transit. That is a statute that exists that governments can take advantage of and put it on the ballot as a referendum for voters to vote for. There are some opportunities like that. We've had a conversation about doing exactly that here in Asheville, Buncombe County. Hasn't happened yet. But there are some opportunities. Now, it has to be used for transit. In their case, they voted for it because they thought they were going to get light rail. And the legislature put the kibosh on that. So they're using it for rapid transit and other transit-related expenses.
We have raised the pay of police officers, finally, after a long call for it. Fire department workers got quite a bit of a raise. Are you satisfied that this is going to be fine now for several years? Or...
No, we raised APD, the police department's pay, 6% last year and another 6% this year, which got them over the very important $50,000 mark for starting pay.
That's crazy that it was that low, that it's taking a 12% raise to get over the 50% $50,000 threshold. Wow.
If you think that's crazy, you should look at teacher pay.
Oh, well, I know. I've had episodes about that. That's criminal how low teachers are paid. And Asheville City Schools, they go through city budget and county budget. How much freedom do we have to boost teacher pay within the Asheville City budget?
Not at all. It's all through the county, and it's a local supplement. And so the county has to make that determination to fund the local supplement. Kind of an odd thing, since we have a separate city and county school system, one of very few, maybe two left in the state, but it goes through the county. That's how it's structured. But I think the cost of hiring and paying employees has skyrocketed, and rightly so, because these employees have got to buy groceries and pay the rent or mortgage or whatever, and all of these costs are increasing. So on the one hand, we're seeing greater and greater pay for employees. We want to have talented and great employees here at the city, so we need to think about the competition and be able to pay our employees competitively. And we now are matching, we're close to what Greenville, South Carolina, for example, is paying a starting officer. That's what we're trying to look at in terms of the metrics to try to boost that pay. But also the cost of living in Asheville is higher. So if we even want to hope that any of our officers or firefighters or other employees are able to live in the city, they're going to need to be paid more. So to your point, I think next year, we got a couple of things going on. One, we dipped into fund balance. We dipped into our savings to balance this budget. And you can't sustain that on a recurring basis. So we do anticipate we're going to have to raise taxes next year just to shore up the budget. But also, we're hopeful that our bond package will pass. The voters will support the bond package this fall. And that's $80 million.
Talk about what's in this bond package. What are you asking for?
So there's 4 pieces of the bond package. $20 million is for affordable housing, $20 million is for parks and rec, $20 million is for transportation, which could be streets, sidewalks, greenways, and then $20 million is for public safety infrastructure. We have old firehouses. We have old infrastructure that needs to be updated so that our employees are working and living in an environment that's good for them, that's comfortable for them to operate out of.
What would the bond be asking of our citizens individually? We talked a little bit about what the property tax increase was going to cost homeowners. What would it cost people, residents of this city, for this bond referendum?
So we're going to have that tonight. We're going to be voting on the bond package tonight, but we have it based on the average value of a home, which I think is based on a home of $400,000 or $425,000, and what the cost to individuals will be. The current average residential property value is around $350,000, but it is forecasted that after the revaluation, the average home value will be more like $420,000.
Oh my God, that's a huge
increase
in valuation.
So $80 million general obligation bonds is the equivalent of about 2.6 cents in our budget, which is about $110 a year for someone with a home value of $420,000, according to this.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is the events happening in larger Democratic circles these days. Biden's exit from the race. Were you happy with him leaving, or did you think that had to happen? And if so, what do you think should happen going forward?
I'm very glad that he decided to step down, and I'm sure that was a very difficult decision for him. And so I'm thankful that he was able to do that. And I'm super excited. I am very excited. I think it's very interesting to see everyone get really energized and coalesce around Kamala Harris. And I think that'll be a successful winning campaign. I'm so curious to see who she chooses as a running mate. Obviously, our own governor is being considered.
I was just going to ask you about that. How seriously do you think he should be considered? He's among 4 governors that I've seen who are in that A list being considered, the governor of Pennsylvania being among them and others. Give me a sense of Roy Cooper and where you think he would be as a vice president.
I first met Roy Cooper when I worked in the legislature in 1998 as a new attorney working in the legislature, and he was a state senator. And he's an amazing guy. He's incredibly smart. He is everything he holds himself out to be. He's honest. He's transparent. He just is who he is. And I have to say, not every politician, of course, is like that. So I just think he's a good guy. I think the decision of who to pick, obviously, you've got this political equation. And I think one of the things that he brings to the table that might not be as well known about him is that he does have a lot of support in the Black community. And I think that's pretty critical. Obviously, North Carolina is a critical state. We're a swing state. You can lose North Carolina and still win as a Democrat the presidency. So not critical in that sense.
It's not Pennsylvania.
It's not Pennsylvania. It's not Arizona. I know Mark Kelly's being considered. So I think that there's a lot of pros and cons about who you pick and how difficult that is. I assume it's going to need to be a white guy.
Yeah, I think so too,
Right.
probably.
Just about the ticket out.
Yeah.
So just please note that the ticket never needed balancing before when it was 2 white guys. But
Right.
still, I recognize that today, apparently, that is necessary.
Hey, and just because you come from that state doesn't mean you're going to carry that state. I remember when Al Gore was the vice president with Bill Clinton, they didn't carry Tennessee.
Right.
So that's not a shoo-in necessarily.
Yeah, and some people have said that Roy Cooper had a real tough battle on his hands when he beat McCrory by around 10,000 votes. But here's a guy who's been able to win as governor and then reelected as governor even when Donald Trump won this state during both of those elections. So clearly people filled out that ballot and zigzagged their way all the way down and included Roy Cooper. So I think that's a powerful thing to consider.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about is just your assessment of how effective this council has been. We're coming into another election. 2 of your council colleagues are running again for re-election. And we're going to at least see at least 1 newcomer, maybe more. Give me your assessment of this last term, these 2 years with this council, and how successful it's been on moving the city forward on the important issues that we're facing.
I think we get the job done. I don't think there's any question about that. At the end of the day, when I look at the bottom line, the work is getting done. And I think this council is very thoughtful and does their homework and thinks about every decision that they make. I think being on the council of any city, especially a progressive city that's got a lot going on, and it can be loud and it can sometimes be hard to think clearly, get your way through each issue and feel like you're making your best informed decision. That's just a constant challenge. And there's a lot of negativity. Literally, we've had council members whose homes have been, people showed up there and
just recently with the bid.
Right. Smashed out windows. And politics is rough. And being on a city council is rough. And I signed up for the job. I enjoy the job for the most part. But I think that when you're being scrutinized and there's a lot of noise, it can make it hard for a group to work together all the time in a way that facilitates the best decision making. And so we try, despite that, to accomplish that task. But I don't know what would make it better exactly, but I know it can be real challenging.
You are in your 3rd term as mayor, and you said you enjoy it for the most part. I'm wondering what your thoughts are when your term expires. Do you think you are going to run again?
So I am in the middle of my 3rd term. It does end in December of 2026. So I got a little ways before it's over. When I'm at the end of this term, I will have served in office for 17 years. So that's a long time.
It is. And you still have your own private practice.
Yes. Well, we don't hire full-time mayors, so I got to have a job. And that's unfortunate, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm turning 53 tomorrow.
Happy
tomorrow.
birthday.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah. I guess now I could just run for president, right?
We're in such a topsy-turvy political environment. Have you ever had ambitions for higher office, even running for state senate or anything like that?
I've thought about it. I've certainly been approached when those vacancies have occurred. And as I mentioned, I worked in the state legislature for 4 years. And I think that work is so interesting. And it would be such an honor to serve the community in that way. I don't know if that's in my future. It's not really possible to do that job and my other job. As a lawyer, it would be rather impossible to do both at the same time right now.
Thanks, Esther. I really appreciate it. That was great.
Thank you. This was fun.
I want to thank Mayor Esther Manheimer for her time and today's great conversation. If you value the Overlook's place in Asheville's media landscape, please consider joining dozens of others who are supporting the show through my Patreon crowdfunding page. Become a member for as little as $5 a month. Visit patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. Our First Look newsletter gives you just a handful of daily headlines from around the local media landscape to get you on your morning. We also have a weekly newsletter devoted to all things The Overlook that hits you every Friday. Both are free and available at podavl.com/newsletter. The theme song for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes to us courtesy of the Asheville duo The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes come out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on any social media channel at AVL Overlook. And I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook with Matt Peiken.